Hi, my name is Patrick von Schlag, and welcome to this course. When we talk about ITIL and IT service management, broadly speaking, what we're trying to get at is how we do IT business alignment. In the last 20 years in my IT career, I've worked in a number of roles trying to help organizations do effective alignment between the business's requirements for service and how we in IT provision and deliver those services. Starting in the late 1980s, I was part of one of the original service management teams building and implementing ITIL service desks here in the United States. After that, worked with a number of different technical functional management teams, both in the energy industry and the networking business. And I've spent most of the last 13 years working in various IT business alignment consultancy roles, working in training programs, and also working collaboratively with a number of Fortune 500 and large government customers on looking at how to do implementations of best practice methodologies, leveraging ITIL, leveraging maturity methodologies, leveraging best practices in project management, business analysis, and ultimately how to get value. How do I deliver value for the services that my customer is looking for, and how do I do that as efficiently and effectively as I can? I hold the certification for IT service management and also have been working for the last 15 years in a number of different disciplines supporting certifications for TCP/IP. I've been a member of several CompTIA boards supporting CompTIA certification programs, and have also worked collaboratively with a number of other vendors in building and supporting their certification programs, including vendors such as Cisco and Dell. More recently, have been working the last 6 years running a consultancy working with large customers who are trying to effectively understand how to leverage and do ITIL best practices successfully, and I hope you'll find some of the benefits of those in the courses that you take. Look forward to working with you on these courses. Thank you for taking part in them, and we look forward to having you in future classes as well. Good luck to you. Hi, and welcome to the ITIL Orientation course. In this course, we're going to talk a lot about ITIL itself, the actual IT infrastructure library, which is literally just that. It's a library of books. And we're going to talk even a lot more about the broader idea of IT service management. How do we manage services effectively throughout their life cycle? We'll introduce a broad overview of IT service management, how service management and ITIL fits alongside other frameworks and models and quality systems like Six Sigma and PMBOK and COBIT and a number of others. We're going to talk a little bit about ITIL version 3 in specific, and then we'll introduce you to the various aspects of the service lifecycle. We'll talk about service strategy, planning for services, thinking about how to leverage the resources we have, the capabilities we have to deliver as much value as we can for our customers. We'll talk about service design. How do we understand our customers' requirements for service, and then how do we carefully plan and implement and design services that are going to meet those needs efficiently and effectively, that are going to make the maximum and most optimal use of the costs involved in order to make sure that we're delivering an optimal level of value. We'll talk about service transition and how services move from development environments to build environments to test environments and ultimately out into the live production environment, and how to coordinate and manage those changes in a way that hopefully protects the services that you already have and ensures more likelihood of successful changes. Talk about service operation. How do we keep services up and running successfully? How do we respond when there are disruptions to service? How do we get users up and running as quickly and efficiently as we can? And how do we go through the process of continually improving our processes, our services, and looking at what the business drivers are driving those types of changes and making sure that we're appropriately focusing not only on provisioning services but sustaining them, making sure that they have those capabilities over the long haul to continue to meet the evolving needs of the business as the business grows and as the organization's needs evolve and change. As you're getting through this course, I want you to keep in mind the notion of service management. In ITIL, we're really interested less about technology and the particular technology components and more about the whole end-to-end service, and particularly the user of that service, because that's what they care about. The user is using that service to underpin and support their business activities to be able to help the organization meet its mission. And so they're really interested in being provided a whole end-to-end service. And from our perspective, that means working very closely together in cross-functional, cross-technology teams to be able to enable and deliver support for that. And so as you go through the course, notice carefully where we talk about service. And remember again that every time we use that, we're referring specifically to end-to-end services, not specific technologies, but the service from that user's point of view. We hope you have a wonderful time in the course, and thank you for being with us. We look forward to working with you. In this section, we're going to introduce you to some of the broad concepts of IT service management, how to use models like CMMI, ITIL, the PMBOK, security models like ISO 27002, and other types of things together to provision and deliver effective service on behalf of your customers. We're going to talk a little bit about some key terminology that you need to know and understand clearly, what we mean by a function, a process, a role, and how those things come together to enable us to deliver better service on behalf of the customer. One of the things that organizations look at when they think about IT is the total cost of ownership and where that money is actually going. Take a look at some of the information on this slide here. When IDC took a look at where money was being spent in total cost of ownership of IT services, over 5 years we're trying to transition, but still 60% of the money that we're going to spend on total cost of ownership is going to be spent on non-process focused manual tasks just to maintain and keep the IT service delivery environment up and running. If you look at the picture in the bottom right, really 70% of the energy is being spent sustaining and running just our existing services, keeping stuff up and running. And only 30% of our capabilities are really being invested in looking at future needs of the business and how we can deliver better qualities of service. The broad goal here is to be able to transition that measure a little bit so that we're spending less of our resources maintaining existing capabilities, and that we're going to be able effectively to reinvest those resources in enhancing and bringing new services, new capabilities, and new opportunity to the business to enable the business to be more efficient and more effective. If you look at the Gartner data, one of the things that they've discovered is that organizations who are adopting IT service management best practice frameworks are definitely seeing very specific total cost of ownership reductions. In the statistics that they came out with, these numbers came to be as high as 48%. Not promising that you would get quite that much, but ultimately there's a very significant opportunity here for organizations to spend less of their time firefighting, less of their time reacting, and more of their time proactively provisioning and delivering effective service. When we think about the broad value to the business of IT service management, largely it's about IT business alignment. And this is something we've obviously been talking about for many years in IT, but something that IT service management in particular gives us a real opportunity to try to do effectively. When we think about why we're in business and what things we're supposed to be doing in IT, it's to enable our businesses to perform, to understand the business processes, the broader business goals and objectives, and then to provision and deliver services that are going to effectively deliver against that. So as things evolve, as the business is responsible for requiring and responding to legal issues, regulatory issues, market issues, they're counting on us to be able to handle change, to be able to work effectively, to provide real-time responses to the issues that they're looking at, and ultimately to be able to do that in a way that's cost optimized. They're not necessarily asking for us not to spend any money, but they want to make sure that when they make investments that they're going to be able to get effective value from those, and those are going to be able to deliver what the business needs to do in order to meet their obligations and obviously to be able to compete effectively in their markets. If you look at some data that came from the Hackett Group recently, they found that organizations that were implementing IT best practices were able to save between $2.1 and $5.5 million for every $1 billion in revenue. So very significant bottom line savings, and at the same time, very significant quality of service additions to the business and their ability to keep services up and running and to effectively get services to them provisioned more efficiently and more quickly. So when we think broadly about IT service management, we're thinking about how we design services, how we effectively implement services, and then how we maintain and operate those services in an efficient and effective way. And we're really looking at combining a number of different frameworks, models, and quality systems in a way that's going to enable us to consistently deliver high-quality services and continue to improve those over time. So when we think about the big domains of IT service management, we'll certainly think about things like the ITIL framework, but we're also going to consider other types of things. Things like IT governance. How do I maintain authority and control over what's happening in my operations? How do I make sure if I put good processes and procedures in place that they're actually going to get followed and people are going to do the things that they need to do? So there are models like COBIT that enable us to go and do good governance and infrastructure, and ITIL works very closely in concert with that. Likewise, most organizations leverage and use various types of quality metrics, whether we're talking about things like Six Sigma, Lean, ISO 27002 for security, project management methodologies like the PMBOK or Prince2. Essentially what we're trying to do is to have consistent processes that deliver consistent outcomes. And IT service management really serves as a basket to pull all of those pieces together. So one of the first questions I tend to get asked when I'm working with my customers is, what are the key critical success factors to making ITIL work in their organization? How do we go and actually make the stuff happen? And it always begins with strong leadership from the top. Do we have management buy-in? Do we have strong, committed, vocal executive leadership that's going to enable us to get past talking about things like IT business alignment and really maintain the necessary commitment to use consistent process to get the results that you want? Do we have a reasonable understanding of our current levels of capability? We do something called a maturity assessment, try to get a sense of where your organization is relative to the ideal, and this really tries to drive where we're going to spend our time and energy in the short term, trying to help your organization begin the process of improving itself. Do we have some well-defined implementation strategies and plans? You can't do everything at once. And so part of the goal here is to build momentum by understanding and identifying those key things that your organization can get some quick value from, at the same time putting in place things like continual service improvement programs to enable you to look at all your processes, all your services, and be able to do the things that you need to do to continuously improve those. Do we have effectively defined roles and responsibilities? Do we know who's going to do what? And do we have clear, unambiguous accountability? Do we have particular owners for our services, for our processes? Do we know who is specifically responsible for managing and overseeing the aspects of those things? And do those resources and roles have the necessary authority to make sure that those processes are effectively followed and the outcomes are effectively delivered for their customers? Do we have clearly well understood purposes, goals, and objectives for the various activities that we're doing? Do we know why we're doing them? Do we know what we're doing them for? Do we have a clear understanding of exactly how we're going to measure success? How do we know that this process is actually working and delivering the expectations of the customer on the back end? And then lastly, we need to identify very specific key performance indicators and metrics that we're going to track against. For each one of our critical success factors, how exactly are we going to go and measure success and results, and how do we make sure that we are actually delivering on the things that we need to do? So there are a number of basic need-to-know concepts in IT service management. We're going to go through these in some detail here. We'll talk a little bit broadly about the service provider model. What do you need to really think about in terms of being a service provider, whether you're an internal service provider to your own internal customers or an external service provider? How do you take advantage of the various frameworks, models, and quality systems and pull that stuff together in a way that enables you as a service provider to do the things that your customers are looking for from you? We'll talk about the notion of a good practice. What does it really take to deliver a good practice to your customer? What exactly do we mean when we talk about things like service management and a service anyway? How do we leverage things like service models to structure and create services? And then get specifically looking at what functions, what processes, what roles would we need to put in place in order to enable and deliver on these things. When you think broadly about an IT service provider, there are lots of different aspects of putting together, provisioning, and delivering a service that you really need to think about. One of them is basically the notion of governance. How do I maintain authority and control over what my people are doing, whether our processes are being followed? How can I make commitments as management that we're going to be able to provision and deliver a service efficiently and effectively that's going to do what our customer needs them to do? So we've got to have some model in place for being able to govern and control and measure whether or not we're doing the things that we need to do. We certainly need to have some way of managing our service lifecycle. How do we plan for and strategize where to use our limited capabilities and resources to be successful? How are we designing services, and how do we make sure when we design services that they're designed effectively to meet the needs of the business, so that the business isn't overspending on the service and that we're provisioning a finite and consistent quality and quantity of service back to that customer. We need to think about how we're going to manage programs and projects. A number of organizational best practices like the PMBOK and Prince2 certainly want to be able to leverage and use those kinds of models when we go and create and manage projects in any portion of the life cycle. How do we transition services out of the development environment and ultimately into the production environment? And then, of course, how do we maintain and operate those services effectively, and how do we improve those? So we need to have some focus on that in service management throughout that life cycle. IT quality, how do we maintain and build quality into everything that we do? And then how do we use quality management to sustain and support our continual service improvement activities so that we're making sure that our services, once they're provisioned and delivered out to the customer, are being evolved as the customer's needs evolve, and that we look for opportunities to improve our processes and improve our services. And then, of course, very important for a lot of us now is securing all of this stuff. So we have all these capabilities and services, but we need to be able to have consistent policy that we can execute effectively, and we need to be able to make sure that we can support and govern against that policy and make sure that the policy is effectively followed. So in order to do that, we're really talking about a broad service provider capability model. How we manage that service life cycle, how we identify and assess what our relative capabilities are, and in which scopes and which areas we're going to provision and deliver them. Take a look at this picture here. So there are lots of things to think about if you're an IT service provider, but in the end it begins there in the middle with what we call our resources, our people, our infrastructure, any information that we have access to, key applications we leverage and use. We only have so many resources. And so ultimately the big idea, of course, is to deliver as much value as we can to our customers and leverage those resources as efficiently and effectively as we can to deliver that value out to our customer. We want to be able to support the customer's outcome needs. So in order to do that, a lot of things have to take place. We have to be able to control what's going on and how we leverage and use those resources. Things like the COBIT framework really enable us to govern and oversee what's happening with various types of resources in our environment. If you look over where we talk about the service provider delivery platform, we have to be able to deliver on the services that we have, which means we need to be able to strategize which services are going to be most needed by our customers, design those services efficiently and effectively to the customer's specific needs, and be able to successfully transition and deliver those services effectively. And of course, not last but certainly not least, to be able to operate and keep those services sustained and up and running in the organization. So we're going to leverage things like the IT service management frameworks from ITIL to enable us to support all of those aspects of the service lifecycle. If you look down toward the bottom, there are many, many different aspects of doing all that work, right? So we have to think about things like how we manage projects, how we both identify and design quality into our services, and how we use continual service improvement activities to sustain and improve quality over time. How we're going to actually govern, control, and audit things like security. How do we validate and do information verification, information assurance to make sure that those services are provisioned and available? And last but certainly not least, what is our relative level of capability? Because we're not all going to start with perfectly defined infrastructures, perfectly defined capabilities. So we need to understand where we are now and have a strategy for systematically improving the overall maturity of our organizations, maturity of our processes, and ultimately all of this is done specifically in support of delivering the right level of outcome for the business. How do we effectively understand the business's requirements and then provision and deliver effective service against that? So let's take a look at some of the different frameworks that are going to be involved in helping to manage a service provider model. The first one I want to really talk about is IT governance. So if you take a look at the slide here, when we think about governance, broadly speaking, we're talking about authority and control. Can I maintain control and authority over all the different aspects of what I do? How we strategize services, look at our limited resources, our limited capabilities. Which things are we going to invest in? How are we going to deliver the right level of value for the customer? Looking at design, transition, operation, and improvement of services over time. So a group called the ISACA, the Information Systems Audit and Control Agency, created a framework for maintaining and managing governance is called COBIT. COBIT is business-oriented. It's really focused on specific processes, has reached a level of general acceptance in the industry at this point, and really is responsible for helping make sure that if your organization has specific regulatory audit requirements, that you're going to be able to demonstrate specific controls, specific authorities over the kinds of things that you're doing in your IT organization. The scope for things like COBIT: how do I plan and organize services? How do I use my people? How do I use my applications, my information, other types of resources available to me? How do we acquire and implement services? Are there controls in place to do that? How do we deliver and support services that are out in our production environment now? And then how do we monitor and evaluate those services over time? How do we look at what's happening with those services? How do we use those metrics as drivers for looking at things like continual service improvement activities and so forth? In terms of looking at service lifecycle management, the de facto standard here is the framework called the ITIL. And when we look at IT infrastructure library, broadly speaking, we're looking at 5 key portions of the life cycle, and each one of them have a whole series of best practices associated with them. We think about service strategy. How do I use my limited resources efficiently and effectively to deliver as much value as I can to my customers, potentially to capture value for us as the service provider so that we can sustain our efforts. In service design, we're looking at understanding the customer. What is happening with the customer? What are their requirements for service? And how do we provision services that are sufficiently fit for the purposes that the customer has and are sufficiently available, secure, protected, and that there's enough of that service in order for us to be able to sustain and deliver the capability on behalf of the customer. Service transition really looks at issues of how we get stuff out of the development environment into the live environment. And if you look at some of the industry statistics there, you understand that most disruptions to service, most incidents that are found in most organizations are driven not because something in operations breaks in and of itself, but usually as a result of a change error that's occurred. So getting control of transition is very, very fundamental to this. Service operation: how do I keep services up and running? And if they are stopped being up and running for some reason, how do I get them up and running as quickly and efficiently as possible? Can we be proactive about looking at things like what are happening with our services? How do we maintain operational health of those services, hopefully before there are user incidents and user downtime? And then continual service improvement looks broadly at the idea, how do I improve services? A lot of the things that we know about continual service improvement are not particularly new, but if you think about the day-to-day activities of most IT organizations, we simply don't spend enough energy focusing on improvement activities themselves. Do we look at each process, each service that we have, and maintain and improve that service over time? When we start looking at specific resource management, we really are talking about projects. How do we create projects? How do we manage projects? And how do we make sure that projects come to a successful completion? There are a couple of different best practices in this arena, the PMBOK and Prince2, but they're really focused on the same key aspects. How do we effectively initiate projects, make sure we have appropriate scope and charter, make sure we have allocated sufficient resources to work the project, building an effective project plan, executing and controlling the project through the project's life cycle, monitoring activities on an ongoing basis, and then being able to close that project out on the back end when the thing is all said and done. So when we think about this, broadly speaking, there's a portfolio aspect to this. I have all my capabilities, all my resources, all my services that I need to be able to provision and deliver. How do I maintain and govern all of those resources? I have program aspects to that. There are certain subsets of my portfolio, my service pipeline, the services I have currently in operation and so forth, that I want to be able to maintain and manage accordingly. And then specific projects either to provision and deliver new services, make improvements to existing services and so forth that need to be governed and managed. And so when we think about the scope of this, we were talking about all processes, all services that are subject to change, which is just about everything. There are a number of different quality methodologies, and one example of this might be something like Six Sigma. When we talk about quality in this context, we're thinking about how do we effectively build and maintain a sufficient level of quality in the services that we provision in our organization. And so when you think about the history of quality management, it's really been about making sure, first of all, that quality is not an afterthought. Quality is a fundamental part of any service. And so as we're designing a given service for a customer, it's very important for us to effectively define what the quality metrics are associated with that service, and then to be able to effectively measure those as that service is created, as the service is transitioned, and then of course as the service is then operated in the live environment. Analyze what we find, look for opportunities for improvement. There obviously will be some. Some of them will be technology driven, some of them will be customer driven, some of them will be process driven. And we need to understand and look for those things and then be able to maintain controls over what's happening through that life cycle. So again, when we think about quality, we want all of our processes, all of our services to be subject to effective quality management. How do we look for opportunities for continual improvement for each process? How do we build quality into each service that we provision and deliver? Security management is clearly a key interest for most organizations. And so there are a lot of different aspects to think about in looking at security and security standards. The ISO has delivered a number of different security standards over the years. ISO 17799 got a lot of traction over the last 5 to 10 years. Recently, the 27000 family of security standards is very fundamental to a lot of organizations' strategies for maintaining and showing information assurance, information security controls to their respective customers. A lot of different things that we need to think about. How do we actually manage security? How do I actually, as a governing manager, show people that in fact we have effective security policy and that those policies are being meaningfully governed and controlled throughout our access? How do we make sure that security is really baked in to all of our processes, all of our services in a way that's going to meet the customer's security requirements? Certainly you have to identify which are the critical business applications that may have disproportionate needs for security capabilities. How do we oversee and govern installations of computers, networks, development of new systems and services in a way that are going to enable us to maintain and ensure appropriate levels of security? And again, the scope is really for everything. All processes, all services need to have that sufficient level of security that the customer requires in order to enable those services to be of value. So let's take a look at this IT service provider capability model. So if we think about all the things that we've just talked about around quality, around security, around project management capability and so forth, it really gets measured, and the service provider itself is really going to be measured on 3 particular capabilities. The first one is what we might call the capability of practice. What exactly is the service provider able to provide in terms of services, in terms of governance and controls, in terms of being able to manage projects, manage security, build in quality, and so forth. So that capability of practice, or the COP, really serves to describe what we're going to be able to provision and deliver. And obviously different service providers have different capabilities that they bring to the table. Second part is what we might think of as the quality of practice. Okay, how exactly do we measure the output value of the services that we provide? How are we measuring delivery of quality? You know, if I make a certain level of commitment to provision a service at a certain level of security, a certain level of performance, a certain level of availability, can we effectively do that? And then quality of service really gets to, you know, how well can I meet those requirements? So if you look at those three things taken together, that really assesses and identifies the full scope of the capability of that service provider. If you look across the top of the diagram, you'll notice the circles for continual service improvement, because your goal as a service provider, whether you're an internal provider or an external provider, is to get better. How do we provision and deliver more and more capability, more and more quality, more and more quality of end service to our customers, and ultimately leveraging things like effective project management, quality management, security controls are going to enable us to build more and more capability over time. So let's look at this from the customer's point of view. When you think about how service models are actually deployed in the customer environment, if you look at the picture here, it really starts on the left with the enterprise's goals. The enterprise has key business objectives it's trying to meet. And in order to do that, the enterprise itself is going to create and implement various types of business processes to enable those goals to happen. Most enterprise business processes today are very much dependent on IT services in order to enable them to achieve successfully. Whether those services are delivered by internal IT organizations, external IT organizations, customer really doesn't care. The customer cares that their processes are going to function so that they can go and achieve the goals that they need to. And so ultimately we need, as a service provider, to be able to manage our internal resources, our external partners, in a way that's going to enable us to deliver what we call a service level agreement. It's a defined level of service to support those enterprise business processes that are going to enable us to deliver on those broader enterprise goals. So if you think about the basket of IT services, then we as the service provider are really responsible for managing a platform of services that we're going to provision in support of those enterprise processes, which means being able to manage my internal teams, being able to manage my external service providers, and being able to do that in a way that's consistent, that's going to help us deliver reliable outcomes to the business. There are a number of different proprietary models that are associated with this. One model that does this includes ITSM, which is really reflected in a lot of the other things that we've already talked about. So let's talk about what we mean in the IT service management universe when we talk about a good practice. And it's interesting that they use the term good practice instead of best practice, because of course all practices are subject to continual service improvement. So even if something is a best practice in theory today, it really shouldn't be tomorrow, because we should be looking for opportunities to improve it, opportunities to improve how we leverage and use it. But when we think about a good practice, broadly speaking, we're thinking about something that's efficient, that's effective, and that delivers the results that we want. So when we think about efficiency, are we using the right level of resources to get some piece of work done? Am I using the right people? Am I using the right amount of financial resources, hardware, applications, other types of capabilities that I may have? Or am I leveraging those efficiently to deliver what I'm supposed to deliver? Effectiveness really gets at, am I delivering the result? Am I delivering the result the customer wants? Because if I'm really efficient, but I don't deliver the right outcome, I don't really get what I need as the customer. So I want to make sure that we are using all of our sources, all of our capabilities to drive the delivery of an effective result for the customer that's going to enable them to provision and do what they need to do. Now, there are many sources of good practice. Many of them are public frameworks, things like IT service management, the PMBOK, things that have been used in many, many organizations successfully, that are good practices because they've been proven over a long period of time to work efficiently and effectively to deliver consistent high-quality outcomes. Some of these are obviously more proprietary. Most service providers have practice guides and other kinds of key capabilities that they bring to the table to enable organizations to have successful implementations and those are generally more privately and closely held. So when we think about good practices, it could be a combination of publicly available standards, methods, and so forth, along with potentially some proprietary ones as well. One of the obvious questions that gets begged as we start talking about service management is what exactly do we really mean when we say a service anyway? When we think about a service, broadly speaking, we're thinking about something that's going to deliver value to the customer without that customer having to own specific costs or specific risks. So for example, if I wanted to fly from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States, there are a couple different ways I could do that. I could buy a plane, I could go to flight school and go learn how to fly the plane and then fly myself from one side of the country to the other. Or I could take a more efficient approach. I could say, you know, I really don't want to own a plane. I really don't want to have to go to flight school and spend all of that money to go learn how to fly the plane. What I'd like instead is to leverage and use a service provider, say an airline, and that I would just buy a seat on one of their planes and they would fly me from one place to the other. The key goal with any particular service is to be able to get the outcome that you want more efficiently. I want to be able to get from one side of the country to the other. By leveraging the service provider, it's going to facilitate my ability to get that desired outcome efficiently and effectively. Again, I want to be able to enhance my performance. So instead of me having to go through all of the pain and suffering of paying for a plane, paying for training, and all those other things, you know, I'm going to be able to take advantage of many different flights, many different available resources, different combinations of services, depending upon what I'm looking to do. And clearly it reduces the effects of certain constraints. Maybe I can't afford a plane right now. And so rather than having to try to spend years and years trying to save money so that I can afford some kind of a small plane, you know, what I would end up doing, of course, is leveraging somebody else's investment to go and take the flight to where I need to go. Broad objective here is to get to the desired outcome. Can we deliver a consistent outcome to the customer? Is that probability increased as a result of provisioning and delivering that service? There are a few key terms that you're going to want to be familiar with as we go through the ITIL Orientation course. You know, one of them is the general notion of a function. When we think about a function in ITIL, we're thinking about a team or a group of people and the tools that they're going to use to carry out one or more processes or activities. Now, this could be a permanent team, like a service desk. It could be a temporary team, like a project team coming together to support a continual service improvement activity, for example. Within a given process, we're thinking about some structured set of activities that are going to enable us to accomplish a specific objective. So a process in general has, you know, governing structures, something that's going to control that process. There are obviously the actual activities, tasks, procedures associated with the process itself. How we deliver and measure the capabilities of that process. We have to have metrics to know that the process is working. And clearly, we're interested in what the results are going to be. Can we deliver the consistent output that the customer is looking for? And then within any particular process, we're going to be using different kinds of roles. And different members of the team are going to play different roles. When we think about a role, we think about some set of responsibilities, key activities, and authorities that we're going to grant to a person or to a team. So if I'm a project manager within a given project, I have a certain set of roles and obligations within that. If we are engaging in an incident management process, I may have a role called the incident manager who's responsible for overseeing and making sure the incident management activities are being engaged in. So one of the things I want you to think about when we start looking at service management in general is to remember that it is about the service. It is really about how we understand the customer's requirements and how we provision and deliver whole end-to-end services that are going to enable that customer to be successful. If you think of a simple example of a power outlet in your wall, when you plug into that power outlet, you have certain basic expectations. You want to just get power. Whatever the device is that you're plugging in, you want to be able to have that device work. You don't want to think about the power capability. Is it 110? Is it 220? How the wiring works in the walls, where the substations or step downs are. that's not important to you as a user of power. As a user of power, you want to be able to plug in and make that service work. And likewise, that's very important for users of IT services. The business has key enterprise objectives, and they're looking for us as IT service providers to be able to underpin and support those, to be able to provision whole services that have enough security, enough quality, enough consistency that are going to enable them to perform and do the things that they need to do. As we go through this course, you're going to have a good chance to see how ITIL processes and these other models enable us to deliver a consistent level of quality for the customer.